Mary. More than 2,000 years ago, in a land shaped by ancient traditions and foreign rulers, a young girl was born whose name would eventually become known throughout the world. Her story would cross continents, influence civilizations, inspire artists and writers, and become part of the spiritual lives of billions of people. That girl was Mary. The exact year of Mary's birth is not known. Like many ordinary people of the ancient world, no official record was created to mark her arrival. Historians believe she was born sometime during the final decades before the beginning of the Common Era, in the region of Judea, which was then under Roman influence. Mary entered a world filled with uncertainty. The Roman Empire controlled vast territories stretching across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Roman power brought roads, trade, and administration, but it also brought heavy taxation, political tension, and military presence. Many Jewish families longed for greater freedom and hoped for a future shaped by justice and peace. The society into which Mary was born was deeply rooted in family, faith, and tradition. Communities were close-knit, and daily life revolved around household responsibilities, religious observance, and agricultural work. Most people lived modestly. Wealth was concentrated among a small portion of the population, while ordinary families worked hard to secure food, shelter, and stability. According to ancient Christian traditions, Mary's parents were named Joachim and Anne. These details come from early traditions preserved by Christian communities rather than from the earliest biblical texts. Whether every detail can be historically verified remains uncertain, but these traditions reveal how early believers sought to understand Mary's family background and upbringing. As a child, Mary likely grew up learning the customs, prayers, and traditions that shaped Jewish life. Religion was not separated from daily existence. Faith influenced family relationships, community celebrations, seasonal festivals, and personal identity. Children learned stories passed down through generations, stories about Abraham, Moses, David, and the prophets who had shaped the history of their people. The landscape surrounding Mary's early life was beautiful yet demanding. Rolling hills, olive groves, vineyards, and small villages dotted the countryside. Shepherds guided their flocks across rocky terrain, while farmers worked fields under the hot Mediterranean sun. Life required perseverance and patience. Young girls in that era were expected to learn practical skills from an early age. They helped care for younger children, prepared food, managed household tasks, and contributed to family life. Education often occurred within the home and community. Knowledge was passed from one generation to another through conversation, observation, and shared experience. Although little is known about Mary's childhood personality, later traditions consistently describe her as thoughtful, humble, and devoted to her faith. Whether viewed through history or tradition, her image became associated with quiet strength rather than public power. As Mary grew older, she lived during a period of growing expectation among many Jewish communities. People discussed ancient promises, prophetic hopes, and the future of their nation. Political tensions existed beneath the surface of daily life. Roman authority remained strong, yet many dreamed of a better future. Among the towns connected to Mary's story, Nazareth became especially important. Located in the region of Galilee, Nazareth was not a large or wealthy city. Archaeological evidence suggests it was a small village with a modest population. Families knew one another closely. Daily routines were shaped by agriculture, craftsmanship, and community relationships. In such a setting, privacy was limited, news traveled quickly, family reputation mattered, social expectations influenced nearly every aspect of life. Individuals were understood not only as separate persons but also as members of families and communities. As Mary entered her teenage years, preparations for adulthood would have become increasingly important. In the ancient world, marriage often occurred much earlier than it does in many modern societies. Families played a significant role in arranging future relationships and ensuring stability. According to long-standing tradition, Mary became engaged to Joseph, a craftsman associated with Nazareth. Joseph is remembered as a man of integrity and responsibility. Though later generations often focus on Mary's role, Joseph's presence would become an important part of her life story. Neither Mary nor Joseph could have imagined how dramatically their lives would change. They were ordinary people living in an ordinary village. They possessed no political influence, military power, or social status capable of attracting attention from rulers or historians. Yet history is often transformed by individuals whose importance is not immediately visible. The years ahead would bring unexpected challenges, difficult journeys, moments of fear, periods of uncertainty, and experiences that would alter the course of religious history. Mary's life would become connected to events remembered across centuries. Before that future unfolded, however, she remained a young woman living within a small community, carrying out daily responsibilities, surrounded by family traditions and familiar routines. The roads of Galilee stretched across the landscape. Merchants traveled between towns, farmers harvested crops, children played in village streets, families gathered for meals and celebrations. Life continued much as it always had. No one could yet know that the story of Mary was only beginning. The young woman from Nazareth would soon embark upon a journey unlike any other, a journey that would take her from obscurity into the memory of humanity itself. As Mary entered young adulthood, life in Nazareth followed rhythms that had changed little over generations. Days were marked by work, family responsibilities, religious observances, and community relationships. The village was small enough that most people knew one another. News spread quickly, and family reputation carried great importance. During this period of her life, Mary became engaged to Joseph. In the culture of first-century Judea and Galilee, engagement was a serious commitment. It involved not only two individuals but also their families and communities. Marriage represented stability, responsibility, and the continuation of family life. Joseph is traditionally described as a craftsman, often understood as a carpenter, though his work may have included a broader range of building and construction skills. Like many working men of his time, he likely earned a modest living through physical labor. He was not wealthy or politically influential. Instead, he belonged to the vast majority of ordinary people whose lives were shaped by hard work and practical concerns. Mary and Joseph's future probably appeared straightforward. They would establish a household, contribute to their community, and raise a family. Such expectations were common and respected, yet events soon unfolded that neither of them could have anticipated. Christian tradition describes a remarkable moment that would become one of the most widely remembered episodes in religious history. According to the Gospel accounts, Mary received news that she would become the mother of a child whose significance would extend far beyond her own community. For Mary, the announcement carried both promise and uncertainty. Regardless of how later generations interpreted the event, the practical realities would have been enormous. In a society where social expectations were strong and reputation mattered greatly, unexpected circumstances could create confusion, questions, and challenges. Ancient texts emphasize Mary's willingness to accept a future she could not fully understand. This theme became one of the defining aspects of her character in Christian memory. Courage, trust, and perseverance became qualities frequently associated with her throughout later centuries. The news also affected Joseph. According to tradition, he faced difficult decisions and personal uncertainty. The future he had expected suddenly seemed less clear. Yet the narratives portray him as choosing loyalty, responsibility, and support during a time that could easily have led to division and conflict. Together, Mary and Joseph began navigating circumstances that placed them at the center of events far larger than themselves. Not long afterward, Mary traveled to visit her relative Elizabeth. The journey itself was significant. Travel in the ancient world was often difficult and sometimes dangerous. Roads varied in quality, and travelers frequently faced long distances on foot or with the assistance of animals. The visit provided companionship during a transformative period in Mary's life. Family connections were essential sources of support in ancient societies. Relatives offered practical assistance, emotional encouragement, and shared understanding during important life events. The meeting between Mary and Elizabeth became an important part of Christian tradition because it highlighted themes of family, faith, and mutual support. It also emphasized the role of women in preserving and sharing experiences that shape future generations. After spending time with her relative, Mary eventually returned home. The months that followed likely involved preparation, anticipation, and perhaps moments of anxiety. Pregnancy in the ancient world carried significant risks. Medical knowledge was limited compared to modern standards, and childbirth remained one of life's most dangerous experiences for women. As the time of birth approached, another development altered Mary and Joseph's plans. Historical sources describe administrative requirements connected to Roman governance. Travel became necessary, and the couple prepared for a journey that would take them away from familiar surroundings. The route from Nazareth to Bethlehem covered considerable distance across challenging terrain. Travelers moved through hills, valleys, and rugged landscapes. Such a trip required endurance, especially for a woman nearing childbirth. The journey revealed a reality shared by countless ordinary people under Roman rule. Political decisions made by distant authorities often affected daily life in profound ways. Individuals and families adjusted to circumstances beyond their control, balancing personal needs with administrative demands. Mary and Joseph eventually arrived in Bethlehem. The town was crowded, and accommodations were limited. Traditions associated with the birth of Jesus emphasized simplicity rather than luxury. The setting reflected the modest social position of the family and reinforced themes of humility that later became central to Christian understanding. When the child was born, Mary entered a new chapter of life. Like mothers throughout history, she faced the immediate responsibilities of caring for a vulnerable infant. Feeding, protecting, comforting, and nurturing a child required constant attention and dedication. At the same time, the birth became connected to expectations and hopes extending beyond the family itself. Ancient narratives describe visitors arriving with curiosity, reverence, and wonder. Shepherds, representing ordinary working people, became part of the story. Their inclusion highlighted the accessibility of the event to common individuals rather than only to the wealthy or powerful. Later traditions also describe learned visitors from distant regions who journeyed in search of the child. Whether interpreted historically, symbolically, or spiritually, these accounts contributed to the growing perception that the child's significance extended beyond local boundaries. For Mary, however, daily life remained grounded in practical realities. Caring for a newborn demanded energy, patience, and resilience. The extraordinary elements of the story existed alongside ordinary experiences familiar to parents throughout history. The family's challenges were not over. Ancient accounts describe growing political danger associated with the fears of powerful rulers. In response, Mary and Joseph became part of another journey, one motivated not by administration but by safety. According to tradition, they traveled to Egypt to avoid threats that placed the child at risk. Such a journey would have been difficult. Leaving home, entering unfamiliar territory, and establishing temporary security required courage and adaptability. Throughout history, countless families have experienced displacement, migration, and uncertainty. For this reason, many later generations found aspects of Mary's story deeply relatable. Themes of protecting children, seeking safety, and enduring hardship resonate across cultures and eras. The period in Egypt remains largely hidden from historical detail. Ancient texts provide limited information about daily life during those years. Yet the experience likely shaped the family profoundly. Living as outsiders in a foreign environment would have required adjustment and perseverance. Eventually, circumstances changed, allowing the family to return. Rather than settling permanently elsewhere, they made their way back toward Galilee and resumed life in Nazareth. For Mary, the return marked the beginning of a long period that receives relatively little attention in historical sources. Years passed quietly. The child grew. Daily responsibilities continued. Family life unfolded within the familiar routines of village existence. These hidden years are important because they remind us that most of Mary's life was not spent amid dramatic public events. Much of her story likely involved ordinary experiences shared by countless mothers throughout history. She prepared meals, managed household tasks, participated in community life, and watched her child mature. Yet beneath the apparent simplicity of daily life, larger developments were taking shape. The boy who had been born in Bethlehem was growing toward adulthood. The world around him remained politically tense and socially complex. Roman authority continued to dominate the region. Religious debates and expectations persisted among the people. Mary could not fully know what the future would bring. Like many parents, she watched her child grow while facing the uncertainties that accompany every new stage of life. The years ahead would introduce moments of pride, concern, misunderstanding, and profound transformation. Her role as a mother would become increasingly connected to events that would eventually influence the course of history. For now, however, life in Nazareth continued. The family worked, learned, worshipped, and lived within their community. Seasons changed. Children became adults. Villagers pursued their daily responsibilities. And Mary, who had already traveled farther than she once imagined, stood at the threshold of an even greater journey still to come. After returning to Nazareth, Mary entered what was perhaps the longest and least documented period of her life. The dramatic journeys, uncertainty, and upheaval that had marked the early years gradually gave way to the steady rhythm of family life. For many years, the family lived quietly, far from the centers of political power and public attention. Nazareth was not a famous city. It was a modest village where life moved according to the seasons. The people depended on farming, craftsmanship, trade, and cooperation within the community. Families knew one another well, and daily routines were shaped by work, faith, and tradition. For Mary, these years were centered on motherhood. Like countless mothers throughout history, she watched her child take his first steps, learn his first words, and gradually discover the world around him. Every stage of growth brought new responsibilities. Food had to be prepared, clothing repaired, household tasks completed, and family relationships maintained. Life in the ancient world required constant effort. There were no modern conveniences to reduce daily labor. Water had to be collected, meals prepared from basic ingredients, and clothing produced or repaired by hand. Even ordinary survival demanded patience and hard work. Mary's days were likely filled with these practical responsibilities. Yet motherhood involved much more than physical care. Children learned values, traditions, and beliefs from their parents. Stories were shared around family gatherings. Religious teachings were passed from one generation to the next. Moral lessons were woven into everyday conversations. As Jesus grew, Mary would have played a central role in shaping his understanding of faith, family, and community. Ancient Jewish culture placed great importance on religious education within the home. Parents introduced children to prayers, sacred traditions, and the history of their people. Festivals and religious observances provided opportunities for learning and participation. Through these experiences, children developed a sense of identity and belonging. The Gospels provide only brief glimpses into Jesus' childhood, but those glimpses suggest a family deeply connected to their religious heritage. One of the most memorable episodes from this period occurred during a journey to Jerusalem. Jerusalem was the spiritual heart of Jewish life. The city contained the temple, one of the most important religious sites of the ancient world. Pilgrims traveled there regularly for major festivals and celebrations. For families living in Galilee, these journeys represented significant events. They required preparation, travel, and coordination with relatives and neighbors. Groups often traveled together for safety and companionship. According to the Gospel of Luke, when Jesus was about 12 years old, Mary and Joseph traveled with him to Jerusalem for a religious festival. After the celebration ended, the family began the journey home. At some point along the route, Mary and Joseph realized that Jesus was not among the travelers. The realization must have been alarming. Imagine the anxiety of parents discovering that their child is missing in a crowded environment far from home. Every passing moment would increase concern. Questions would race through their minds. Where was he? Was he safe? Had something happened? Mary and Joseph returned to Jerusalem and searched for him. After several days, they found him in the temple, engaged in discussion with religious teachers. The story offers a rare glimpse into Mary's emotional experience as a mother. The account emphasizes her worrying, relief, and desire to understand her son's actions. Her reaction feels deeply human and relatable, reminding readers that behind the historical and religious significance stood a real mother experiencing genuine concern for her child. After this event, the sources become largely silent again regarding many years of family life. Historians sometimes refer to this period as the hidden years because so little information survives. Yet these years were likely among the most formative in Jesus' development and among the most significant in Mary's life as a parent. The absence of detailed records should not lead us to assume that nothing important happened. On the contrary, much of human life unfolds in ordinary moments rather than dramatic events. Children grow through daily experiences. Character develops gradually. Families are shaped by countless conversations, challenges, celebrations, and shared responsibilities. Mary's life during these years was probably filled with such experiences. As Jesus matured, he likely learned practical skills, participated in community life, and worked alongside family members. Nazareth provided a setting where relationships, responsibilities, and traditions influenced personal development. Mary observed these changes firsthand. She watched a child become a young man. She saw physical growth, increasing independence, and expanding understanding. She witnessed strengths emerge and talents develop. Like parents everywhere, she probably experienced pride, curiosity, concern, and hope as she imagined the future. At the same time, life in Galilee remained shaped by broader political realities. Roman rule continued to influence daily existence. Taxes burdened many families. Economic opportunities were often limited. Social tensions occasionally surfaced. Religious debates about identity, justice, and the future remained active throughout the region. The world surrounding Mary and her family was therefore both familiar and uncertain. As years passed, Jesus entered adulthood. The transition from childhood to adulthood represented a major turning point for every family. Responsibilities changed. Expectations evolved. New opportunities and challenges emerged. For Mary, this transition likely carried particular significance. Ancient traditions associated with her son's birth had suggested an extraordinary future. Yet for many years, life had unfolded in seemingly ordinary ways. The contrast between early expectations and everyday reality may have prompted reflection and anticipation. Eventually, however, change began to arrive. Jesus started to move beyond the boundaries of village life and entered a more public role. His activities attracted attention from growing numbers of people. Conversations spread across communities. Crowds gathered to hear him speak. His reputation expanded beyond Nazareth. For Mary, these developments must have been both exciting and unsettling. Parents often experience mixed emotions when children pursue paths that lead them away from familiar surroundings. Pride can exist alongside concern. Hope can exist alongside uncertainty. As Jesus became increasingly known throughout the region, Mary witnessed the beginning of a new chapter in his life, and in her own. The quiet years of childhood were ending. The period of public ministry was approaching. Soon, Mary's role would extend beyond caring for her family within a small village. She would become connected to events that attracted attention across Galilee, Judea, and beyond. The ordinary routines of Nazareth would gradually give way to extraordinary circumstances. Yet the lessons learned during the hidden years remained important. Those years had been shaped by family bonds, faith, perseverance, responsibility, and love. They provided the foundation upon which everything that followed would be built. For Mary, motherhood had never been merely a single event. It was an ongoing journey of guidance, sacrifice, patience, and devotion. The child she had nurtured, protected, and watched grow was now stepping into a larger world. And Mary, like so many mothers before and after her, would soon discover that one of the greatest challenges of parenthood is learning to let a child follow a path that cannot be fully controlled or predicted. The years ahead would bring moments of wonder, confusion, joy, and sorrow. They would also bring experiences that neither Mary nor anyone else could have fully imagined. The hidden years were over. A new chapter was about to begin. For many years, Mary's life had been centered on family, community, and the familiar rhythms of Nazareth. She had watched Jesus grow from infancy to adulthood, guiding him through childhood and sharing in the ordinary experiences of daily life. Now, however, everything was beginning to change. News about Jesus was spreading beyond the boundaries of his hometown. More people were hearing his teachings. More communities were discussing his message. What had once been private was becoming public. For Mary, this transformation brought a mixture of emotions. On one hand, she could see that her son was making a profound impact on those around him. People listened carefully when he spoke. They traveled long distances to hear his teachings. Many found hope, encouragement, and inspiration in his words. On the other hand, increasing attention also brought uncertainty. Public influence often attracts both supporters and critics. The more visible a person becomes, the more likely disagreements and opposition become. Mary would soon witness this reality firsthand. One of the earliest public events associated with Jesus' ministry occurred at a wedding celebration in Cana, a town in Galilee. Weddings in the ancient world were major community events. Families gathered together, celebrations could last for days, and hospitality was considered extremely important. Running out of provisions during such an event could cause embarrassment for the hosts and their families. According to the Gospel of John, Mary was present at a wedding where a problem arose. She became aware of the situation and brought it to Jesus' attention. The story is significant because it portrays Mary as attentive to the needs of others. Rather than focusing on herself, she noticed the concerns of those around her and sought a solution. The event also represents one of the earliest moments in which Mary appears connected to Jesus' emerging public role. Although later generations would interpret the event in different ways, the narrative highlights qualities often associated with Mary throughout history: awareness, compassion, practical concern, and quiet confidence. As time passed, Jesus continued traveling throughout Galilee and neighboring regions. He spoke in villages, towns, and open spaces where large groups could gather. Fishermen, farmers, merchants, laborers, and religious leaders all encountered his message. Crowds often followed him from place to place, eager to hear more. Mary undoubtedly heard reports about these developments. Some stories likely filled her with pride. People spoke of lives being changed, communities being encouraged, and individuals finding renewed purpose. Yet not every report would have been comforting. As Jesus gained followers, questions and controversies also increased. Religious leaders debated his teachings. Some welcomed his message, while others challenged his interpretations. Public discussions became more intense. Opinions grew divided. Mary found herself watching from a unique position. She was neither merely a member of the crowd nor a distant observer. She was the mother of the man whose words and actions were attracting attention throughout the region. Such a position carried emotional complexity. Parents often experience conflicting feelings when their children pursue ambitious or unconventional paths. Success can bring joy, but it can also bring concern. Recognition can create opportunities, but it can also attract criticism. Mary likely understood these realities better than most. The public mission that had begun so hopefully was becoming increasingly demanding. Crowds continued to grow. Expectations increased. Some people hoped Jesus would become a political leader who would challenge Roman authority. Others expected social reform or dramatic change. Still others sought personal healing, guidance, or spiritual renewal. Not everyone agreed about what his role should be. These differing expectations created tension. The larger the crowds became, the more difficult it was to satisfy everyone's hopes. Admiration and criticism often existed side by side. Mary watched as public enthusiasm expanded, but so did opposition. Certain religious authorities viewed Jesus with suspicion. Some questioned his teachings. Others worried about his growing influence. Debates became sharper. Public disagreements became more frequent. For a mother, witnessing such developments could not have been easy. She knew the human being behind the public figure. While crowds saw a teacher, speaker, or leader, Mary also remembered the child she had carried, protected, and raised. She remembered family meals, village life, and the many ordinary moments that no one else had witnessed. This perspective likely made the growing tensions feel deeply personal. At times, members of Jesus' family appeared concerned about the increasing demands placed upon him. Large crowds often surrounded him. Travel was constant. Opportunities for rest could be limited. Mary may have worried about his physical well-being, his safety, and the pressures associated with public life. Such concerns are timeless. Throughout history, parents have worried when children face difficult challenges, public scrutiny, or dangerous circumstances. Mary was no different. The more Jesus' influence expanded, the more uncertain the future became. Yet despite the challenges, his mission continued. People gathered on hillsides to listen. Communities welcomed him. Conversations spread from village to village. Stories of healing, teaching, and transformation circulated throughout the region. Mary witnessed these developments against the backdrop of a society already filled with political tension. Roman rule remained firmly in place. Economic hardships affected many families. Social divisions persisted. Public unrest occasionally surfaced. In such an environment, any influential public figure could become the subject of intense attention. As Jesus traveled and taught, the possibility of conflict increased. Mary likely sensed this long before events reached their climax. She had lived through uncertainty before. She had endured difficult journeys, unexpected challenges, and periods of displacement. Her life had already taught her that significant moments often arrive without warning. Now she stood on the edge of another turning point. The crowds remained enthusiastic. Many believed they were witnessing something extraordinary. Yet beneath the excitement, signs of danger were becoming more visible. Opposition was no longer isolated. It was growing. Questions were becoming accusations. Disagreements were becoming confrontations. The future was becoming increasingly uncertain. For Mary, this period required patience and emotional strength. She could not control events unfolding around her son. She could not silence critics or eliminate risks. She could not predict exactly where the path would lead. All she could do was continue forward, carrying both hope and concern. As months passed, Jesus' journeys eventually brought him closer to Jerusalem, the city at the center of religious and political life. Jerusalem was unlike Nazareth. It was larger, more crowded, and more politically sensitive. Religious authorities operated there. Roman officials maintained a strong presence. Public events attracted attention from powerful individuals. Entering Jerusalem would place Jesus at the center of forces far greater than those encountered in Galilee. Mary may have understood the significance of this development. The city represented opportunity, visibility, and influence. It also represented risk. The closer Jesus moved toward Jerusalem, the closer he moved toward confrontation with powerful institutions and competing interests. A sense of anticipation filled the air. Supporters remained hopeful. Critics remained watchful. The future remained uncertain. For Mary, the journey that had begun with motherhood in a small village had now entered a new and challenging phase. She had watched her son grow. She had witnessed the beginning of his public mission. She had seen crowds gather, lives changed, and hopes awakened. But she had also begun to see shadows forming on the horizon. The greatest trials of her life were still ahead, and soon, events in Jerusalem would test her courage, endurance, and faith more deeply than ever before. As Jesus' public ministry continued, his journeys increasingly led toward Jerusalem, the city that stood at the heart of religious life in Judea. For centuries, Jerusalem had held profound significance for the Jewish people. Pilgrims traveled there from near and far. Religious festivals filled its streets with visitors. The temple dominated the city's landscape and served as a center of worship, identity, and tradition. Yet Jerusalem was also a place of political tension. Roman authorities closely monitored activity within the city, especially during major festivals when large crowds gathered. Public excitement could quickly become unrest, and unrest could become conflict. As a result, both religious and political leaders watched developments carefully. When Jesus arrived in Jerusalem during one of these festival periods, public attention intensified dramatically. Large crowds welcomed him. People lined roads and gathered in public spaces. Many believed they were witnessing the arrival of someone who would transform the future. Excitement spread through the city. Mary was aware that a crucial moment had arrived. The years of teaching, travel, and growing influence had led to this point. What happened next would shape history forever. At first, the atmosphere appeared hopeful. Supporters celebrated. Conversations filled the streets. Expectations were high. But beneath the excitement, tensions continued to grow. Religious authorities questioned Jesus more intensely than ever before. Public debates became sharper. Disagreements that had developed over months and years now reached a critical stage. The city became a place of conflicting hopes and competing interests. Some people admired Jesus. Others feared the consequences of his influence. Some believed he represented positive change. Others viewed him as a threat to established authority. Mary could likely sense the growing uncertainty. She had lived long enough to recognize when events were moving toward confrontation. The excitement surrounding Jerusalem was not entirely reassuring. Alongside enthusiasm, there was tension. Alongside celebration, there was danger. Then the situation changed rapidly. Within a short period of time, events unfolded that shocked supporters and transformed the mood of the city. Jesus was arrested. For those who had followed him, the news must have been difficult to believe. Only days earlier, crowds had welcomed him. Now he faced accusations, questioning, and legal proceedings. For Mary, the emotional impact would have been overwhelming. No mother expects to witness such events involving her child. The child she had raised, protected, and loved was now facing public condemnation. The uncertainty that had followed her throughout recent years suddenly became a painful reality. Ancient sources describe a series of trials and interrogations. Political and religious authorities became involved. Decisions were made quickly. Public opinion shifted. The atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Mary found herself facing circumstances that no parent ever wishes to experience. The situation was no longer about criticism or disagreement. It had become a matter of life and death. As events progressed, Jesus was sentenced to execution by crucifixion, a punishment used by Roman authorities for certain serious offenses. Crucifixion was intended not only to cause suffering but also to serve as a public demonstration of power and control. The sentence was devastating. For supporters, it represented the apparent destruction of their hopes. For Mary, it represented something even more personal. It threatened to take away her son. The journey to the place of execution became one of the most remembered scenes in Christian tradition. Crowds gathered. Some mourned. Some watched silently. Others expressed hostility. The city that had recently celebrated now witnessed tragedy unfolding before its eyes. Throughout history, artists, writers, and musicians have attempted to imagine Mary's emotions during these moments. No description can fully capture what a mother experiences when watching her child suffer. Fear, grief, helplessness, disbelief, sorrow, and love may all exist simultaneously. Mary could not stop what was happening. She could not change the decisions that had already been made. She could not remove the suffering. She could only remain present. And so she stayed. Ancient Christian tradition consistently remembers Mary as being near her son during his final hours. This image became one of the most powerful symbols in religious art and literature. Not because it depicts triumph, not because it depicts victory, but because it depicts unwavering love. Even in the darkest moment, Mary remained. The execution itself marked the most painful chapter of her life. The child she had carried in her arms as an infant now hung before her as an adult facing death. The memories of decades seemed to converge into a single moment. Bethlehem, Nazareth, childhood, family life, journeys, conversations, growth, hope, all of it now stood against the reality unfolding before her. Many parents imagine a future in which they leave this world before their children. Mary instead faced the unimaginable experience of watching her child die before her own eyes. The sorrow was profound. It is one reason why Mary's story continues to resonate with people who have experienced loss. Across cultures and generations, parents who have endured grief often find something deeply human in this part of her story. The suffering she experienced transcends historical boundaries. It reflects one of the most painful realities any person can face. Eventually, the ordeal ended. Jesus died. For Mary, silence followed. The crowds dispersed. The noise faded. The activity that had dominated recent days suddenly gave way to grief. The future that had seemed filled with possibility now appeared uncertain. Many supporters felt lost. Many were afraid. Many did not know what would happen next. Mary shared in this uncertainty. The days immediately following the death of Jesus were likely among the most difficult of her life. Grief often arrives in waves. At first there is shock, then sadness, then reflection, then questions. Ancient sources provide only limited details about Mary's experiences during these days, but it is reasonable to imagine the depth of her sorrow. She was no longer simply witnessing public events. She was mourning the loss of her son. Yet even in the midst of grief, the story was not over. According to Christian tradition, events occurred after the death of Jesus that transformed despair into hope and reshaped the future of his followers. The details of those events became the foundation of Christian belief and would influence history for centuries to come. For Mary, however, the immediate reality remained intensely personal. She had endured the greatest sorrow of her life. She had witnessed suffering she could not prevent. She had experienced a loss that would forever remain part of her story. And yet, despite everything, she endured. The strength that had carried her through earlier challenges remained. The courage that had guided her through uncertainty remained. The resilience that had marked her life from the beginning remained. The woman who had traveled difficult roads, faced unexpected circumstances, and raised a child amid uncertainty would now enter another chapter. A chapter shaped not by public attention or dramatic journeys, but by remembrance, reflection, and the continuing influence of the life she had witnessed. The story of Mary was not ending. In many ways, a new phase was about to begin. And through that phase, her influence would spread farther than she could ever have imagined during her quiet years in Nazareth. The death of Jesus marked the end of one chapter in Mary's life, but it did not mark the end of her story. After the grief, confusion, and sorrow surrounding the crucifixion, Mary found herself among a small community of followers trying to understand what had happened and what the future might hold. The public excitement that had once surrounded Jesus had largely disappeared. Many supporters were frightened, some withdrew from public view, others struggled to make sense of recent events. For Mary, these days were likely filled with reflection. She had witnessed nearly every stage of her son's life. She had watched him grow from infancy to adulthood. She had seen moments of joy and moments of hardship. Now she carried memories spanning decades. The ancient sources suggest that Mary remained connected to the circle of believers who continued gathering after the death of Jesus. These men and women came from different backgrounds and experiences, yet they shared a common bond. They had been affected by Jesus' teachings and believed his influence would continue. In those early days, the movement was still small. No one could have predicted that it would eventually spread across continents and become one of the world's largest religions. The followers themselves were ordinary individuals living under Roman rule. They possessed little political power and few resources. Mary's presence among them carried special significance. She represented a living connection to the earliest years of Jesus' life. She had known him not only as a teacher and public figure but also as a child, a son, and a member of a family. For younger believers, Mary was likely a source of wisdom and memory. She could speak about events that no one else had witnessed. She remembered Nazareth. She remembered the journeys of earlier years. She remembered moments hidden from public view. As the community grew, these memories became increasingly valuable. Stories passed from one person to another. Experiences were shared. Traditions began to take shape. The foundation of what would later become Christian history was being formed. Mary occupied a unique place within this process. Although the surviving historical records provide only limited details about her activities during these years, her continued presence appears to have been important to the early community. The book of Acts mentions Mary among those gathered together in prayer with the earliest believers. This brief reference is significant because it places her within the developing movement that emerged after the death of Jesus. She was not portrayed as a ruler or political leader. Instead, she appears as a respected member of the community, someone whose life and experiences commanded attention and respect. As years passed, Christianity gradually expanded beyond its original setting. Travelers carried teachings into new towns and cities. Small communities formed in different regions. What had begun in Judea slowly extended outward into the wider Roman world. Mary lived during the earliest phase of this transformation. She likely witnessed the movement grow from a small circle of followers into a developing community with increasing reach and influence. The growth would not always have been easy. Early believers often faced opposition, misunderstanding, and periods of difficulty. Public acceptance was far from guaranteed. Yet the movement continued to expand. For Mary, observing this development may have brought a sense of fulfillment. She had endured uncertainty throughout her life. She had experienced difficult journeys, periods of displacement, and profound personal loss. Now she could see that the influence of her son's life was continuing beyond his death. One of the greatest challenges for historians studying Mary's later years is the limited amount of direct evidence. The earliest Christian writings provide only a few references to this period. As a result, many details remain unknown. Where exactly did Mary spend her final years? How long did she live after the death of Jesus? Who cared for her as she grew older? What were her daily routines? The historical record does not provide definitive answers. Over the centuries, various traditions emerged to fill these gaps. Some traditions suggest that Mary remained in Jerusalem for a significant period of time. Others associate her later life with Ephesus, a city in what is now modern-day Turkey. Both locations developed important connections to Marian history and devotion. Because the evidence is limited, historians cannot establish every detail with certainty. What is clear, however, is that Mary's reputation continued to grow among Christian communities. As the first generation of believers aged, memories of Mary became increasingly precious. People who had known her personally would not live forever. Their stories, therefore, became valuable links to the earliest days of Christianity. Mary herself was growing older. The young woman of Nazareth had become an elderly woman whose life spanned some of the most significant events in religious history. Age often brings reflection. Older individuals look back across decades and see patterns that were not visible in earlier years. They remember hardships that seemed overwhelming at the time but later revealed unexpected meaning. They appreciate relationships, experiences, and moments that once appeared ordinary. Mary may have experienced similar reflections. She could look back on a life that had included remarkable contrasts. She had known both obscurity and influence. She had experienced joy and grief. She had lived through uncertainty and witnessed extraordinary change. She had traveled from a small village into the memory of generations. As Christianity continued spreading, new believers learned about Mary through stories shared by earlier followers. These stories emphasized qualities that had become central to her image: humility, perseverance, compassion, courage, and faithfulness. And like rulers who built empires or generals who commanded armies, Mary's influence rested primarily upon character and example. This distinction contributed to her lasting appeal. People often admire power, but they connect emotionally with humanity. Mary's story resonated because it contained experiences familiar to countless individuals: family responsibility, uncertainty about the future, concern for loved ones, personal sacrifice, and endurance during difficult times. As her final years approached, she remained part of a world undergoing transformation. The Roman Empire still governed vast territories. Political leaders continued their struggles for influence. Cities expanded. Trade routes connected distant regions. Yet beneath these large historical developments, ordinary human life continued. Families raised children. Communities gathered. People worked, celebrated, mourned, and hoped. Mary's life had always been rooted in these everyday realities. Even as her significance grew, she remained connected to experiences shared by people throughout history. Eventually, the end of her earthly life arrived. The exact circumstances of Mary's death are not recorded in the earliest historical sources. This uncertainty led later Christian traditions to develop different accounts regarding her final days. Some traditions emphasize a peaceful passing surrounded by believers. Others focus on spiritual themes associated with her departure from earthly life. While the tales vary, the central idea remains consistent. Mary's life reached its natural conclusion after decades marked by extraordinary experiences and enduring influence. For the early Christian community, her death represented the passing of one of the last direct links to the earliest chapters of their history. A generation was coming to an end. Those who had personally known Jesus and witnessed foundational events were gradually leaving the stage of history. Their memories would now be preserved through writings, teachings, and community traditions. Mary's influence, however, did not end with her death. In many ways, it was only beginning. Future generations would remember her not only as the mother of Jesus but also as a symbol of compassion, strength, and perseverance. Artists would paint her image. Musicians would compose works inspired by her story. Writers would explore her life through poetry, literature, and scholarship. Churches, cathedrals, and places of worship would be dedicated in her honor. Millions of people across different cultures would find meaning in her example. Yet all of that belonged to the future. The woman herself had lived a human life filled with challenges, relationships, hopes, disappointments, and moments of profound significance. She had walked dusty roads. She had cared for her family. She had faced uncertainty. She had experienced sorrow. She had endured. And through that endurance, her story became one of the most enduring stories in human history. The life of Mary had begun in relative obscurity. It ended with a legacy that would cross centuries and continents. Her journey was complete, but her influence was only beginning to unfold. When Mary died, her earthly life came to an end. She left behind no palace, no army, no political office, and no written works known with certainty to historians. She had not ruled a kingdom or commanded nations. By the standards of the ancient world, she would have appeared to be an unlikely candidate for lasting fame. Yet history often follows unexpected paths. The influence of Mary did not disappear after her death. Instead, it gradually expanded, crossing borders, languages, and cultures until her name became known throughout much of the world. The first generations after Mary's death were a time of rapid change. Christian communities were spreading across the Roman Empire. Small groups of believers gathered in homes, shared teachings, and preserved memories connected to Jesus and those who had known him. These communities existed in cities, towns, and villages separated by great distances. Communication was slow. Travel was difficult, yet stories traveled remarkably well. Among the memories preserved by early Christians were stories about Mary. People wanted to know more about the woman who had raised Jesus. They were curious about her life, her character, and her experiences. As the number of believers increased, so did interest in the people who had played important roles in the earliest chapters of Christian history. Many of the first Christians had never met Mary. For them, she belonged to a previous generation. Yet through storytelling and teaching, her memory remained alive. Parents shared stories with children. Teachers shared traditions with students. Travelers carried accounts from one region to another. Over time, Mary's life became woven into the collective memory of growing Christian communities. As Christianity expanded throughout the Roman Empire, the importance of Mary gradually increased. This development did not happen overnight. The earliest Christians focused primarily on the teachings, death, and resurrection of Jesus. However, as the movement matured, believers began reflecting more deeply on the people connected to those events. Mary naturally became part of those reflections. Questions emerged. What could her life teach future generations? What qualities made her worthy of remembrance? How should believers understand her role within the broader story of Christianity? Different communities explored these questions in different ways. Theological discussions developed. New traditions appeared. Writers began recording stories and reflections connected to Mary's life. Some accounts were based on earlier traditions, others expanded upon existing narratives. Together, they contributed to a growing body of literature that shaped how future generations understood Mary. Meanwhile, Christianity itself was changing dramatically. For many years, Christians had lived as a minority group within the Roman Empire. At times, they faced suspicion and persecution. Public acceptance was far from guaranteed. Then, during the 4th century, a major transformation occurred. Christianity gained increasing recognition and support within the empire. As churches grew and public worship expanded, interest in Christian history also increased. Leaders, scholars, and believers sought to preserve memories associated with foundational figures. Mary's importance grew during this period. Churches dedicated to her began appearing in various regions. Artists created images inspired by her story. Writers explored her significance in greater detail. Her influence spread beyond local communities and became part of the broader Christian world. One reason for this growth was the emotional connection people felt toward her. Mary represented experiences that were universally understood. She was remembered as a daughter, a wife, and a mother. She experienced uncertainty, hardship, and loss. She cared for her family and endured difficult circumstances. These qualities made her relatable. While emperors and generals often seemed distant, Mary's story felt personal. Ordinary people could see aspects of their own lives reflected in hers. Parents understood her love for her child. Families understood her commitment to those she cared about. Those who had experienced grief understood her sorrow. Those who faced uncertainty understood her resilience. This emotional accessibility became one of the strongest foundations of her enduring influence. As centuries passed, Christianity spread beyond the boundaries of the Roman Empire. Missionaries traveled to new regions. Trade routes carried ideas across continents. Communities emerged in Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, and eventually far beyond. Where Christianity traveled, stories of Mary often traveled as well. Different cultures began interpreting her life through their own artistic and cultural traditions. In one region, artists painted her wearing clothing familiar to local communities. In another, musicians composed songs inspired by her story. Elsewhere, writers produced poetry celebrating her role in history. Although these expressions varied greatly, they shared a common purpose. They kept Mary's memory alive. The growth of Marian art became especially significant. Images of Mary appeared in churches, manuscripts, mosaics, sculptures, and later paintings. Some depictions emphasized tenderness and motherhood. Others highlighted dignity and strength. Still others focused on sorrow and compassion. Together, these works formed one of the largest artistic traditions in human history. Generations of artists devoted their talents to portraying Mary. Each era introduced new styles and interpretations. Yet the central themes remained remarkably consistent: compassion, care, hope, endurance, love. As Christianity entered the medieval period, Mary's influence expanded even further. Cathedrals were built in her honor. Pilgrimages connected believers to places associated with her memory. Writers produced extensive works exploring her significance. Musicians created hymns that would be sung for centuries. Her image became deeply embedded in the cultural life of entire civilizations. For many people, Mary represented a source of comfort during difficult times. Europe experienced wars, plagues, famines, and political instability throughout much of its history. Communities facing hardship often turned towards symbols that expressed compassion and hope. Mary became one of those symbols. People prayed, reflected, and sought encouragement through her example. Her story offered reassurance that suffering could be endured and that difficult circumstances did not define a person's worth. At the same time, Mary's influence extended beyond Europe. Christian communities in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East developed their own traditions and interpretations. Local cultures enriched Marian imagery with unique artistic styles and perspectives. As a result, Mary's legacy became increasingly global. Remarkably, her significance also crossed religious boundaries. Within Islam, Maryam gained a place of exceptional honor. Muslims respected her as the mother of Jesus and as a woman of remarkable character and devotion. This shared recognition created an unusual connection between two major world religions. Few historical figures are deeply respected by both Christians and Muslims. Mary became one of those rare exceptions. As centuries continued to pass, her influence entered new forms of culture. Writers referenced her in literature. Composers created masterpieces inspired by her story. Architects designed magnificent structures associated with her memory. Historians studied her life and traditions. Scholars debated historical questions connected to her story. Even people with little religious involvement often recognized her image because it had become so deeply woven into global culture. By the modern era, Mary had become one of the most recognizable women in human history. Her story had traveled farther than anyone living in first-century Nazareth could possibly have imagined. From ancient villages to modern cities, from handwritten manuscripts to digital media, from local traditions to worldwide recognition, her legacy continued growing. What makes this achievement remarkable is that it was not built upon political power. Many famous individuals are remembered because they conquered territories or controlled governments. Mary's influence followed a different path. It was built upon memory, meaning, and emotional connection. People remembered her because they found something deeply human in her story. Across cultures and generations, individuals continued seeing reflections of their own experiences in her life. They saw motherhood. They saw courage. They saw loss. They saw hope. They saw perseverance. And because those experiences are universal, Mary's story remained relevant long after the ancient world disappeared. The Roman Empire eventually fell. Kingdoms rose and collapsed. Borders changed countless times. Languages evolved. Technologies transformed civilization. Yet Mary's legacy endured. The young woman who once lived quietly in Nazareth became a figure remembered by billions. Her life inspired faith, art, music, literature, scholarship, and cultural tradition on a scale few historical figures have ever achieved. The journey that began in a small village had become a global story, and that story continues to this day. When Mary's earthly life came to an end, no one could have predicted the extraordinary journey her memory would take through history. She had lived in a world of dusty roads, small villages, and handwritten scrolls. News traveled slowly. Most people never journeyed far from the place where they were born. Yet over the centuries, Mary's story would cross oceans, inspire masterpieces, influence cultures, and become known in nearly every corner of the globe. The transformation did not happen all at once. It unfolded gradually, generation after generation. As Christianity spread, believers sought to preserve every memory they could about the people connected to its earliest days. Stories about Mary were shared among families, churches, and communities. Some were based on traditions passed down over many years. Others emerged as people reflected upon her significance and sought to understand her life more deeply. Because historical information about Mary's childhood and later years was limited, curiosity naturally grew. People wanted to know more. What was she like as a young girl? How did she spend her daily life? What happened during the years not described in the earliest writings? How did she spend her final days? These questions encouraged the development of additional traditions and stories. Some traditions became widely accepted within particular communities. Others remained local or regional. While historians today distinguish between documented history and later tradition, both played important roles in shaping Mary's image throughout the centuries. As Christianity entered new regions, local cultures added their own perspectives. This process was natural. Every civilization expresses important ideas through its own language, artistic style, and cultural imagination. As a result, Mary's image began changing in appearance while retaining familiar themes. In one country, artists painted her with features resembling local people. In another, she appeared in clothing inspired by regional traditions. Elsewhere, musicians composed songs using local instruments and musical styles to honor her memory. The result was something remarkable. Mary became both universal and local at the same time. People from vastly different cultures could recognize her, yet each community felt a personal connection to her story. By the Middle Ages, Mary's influence had expanded dramatically. Churches dedicated to her could be found across Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Africa. Pilgrims traveled great distances to visit sites associated with her memory. Religious festivals celebrated important moments connected to her life. For many people living during difficult times, Mary became a symbol of comfort. Life in the medieval world was often harsh. Wars erupted unexpectedly. Diseases spread rapidly. Famine could devastate entire regions. Life expectancy was much shorter than today. Amid such uncertainty, people sought sources of hope and reassurance. Mary's story provided both. She was remembered as someone who had faced uncertainty, endured suffering, and remained steadfast through hardship. These qualities resonated deeply with ordinary people. Mothers identified with her devotion to family. Those experiencing grief identified with her sorrow. Communities facing hardship identified with her resilience. As centuries pass, artists became some of the most important contributors to Mary's growing legacy. No other woman in history has inspired more artistic works. Painters, sculptors, mosaic creators, manuscript illustrators, and architects devoted countless hours to portraying her image. Some works emphasized tenderness, others emphasized dignity. Some focused on motherhood, others highlighted courage and endurance. Together, these artistic creations helped shape how generations imagined Mary. Among the most famous artistic representations were paintings created during the Renaissance. This period witnessed an extraordinary flowering of creativity. Artists sought to portray human emotions with greater realism and depth. Mary became one of their favorite subjects. The faces painted during this era often reflected warmth, compassion, and humanity. Rather than appearing distant or unreachable, Mary was presented as someone with whom viewers could emotionally connect. These masterpieces continue attracting millions of visitors to museums and churches today. Yet art was only one part of the story. Music also played an enormous role in preserving Mary's legacy. Throughout history, composers created hymns, choral works, and sacred music inspired by her life. Some pieces were simple and intended for local congregations. Others became grand musical achievements performed by large choirs and orchestras. These compositions carried Mary's story into the hearts and minds of listeners across generations. Literature added another layer. Poets wrote verses celebrating her character. Writers explored her experiences through stories and reflections. Scholars examined her historical significance. Religious thinkers discussed her role within broader theological traditions. As a result, Mary's influence extended far beyond places of worship. She became part of the intellectual and cultural history of entire civilizations. One particularly fascinating aspect of Mary's legacy is the diversity of her titles and representations. Different cultures developed unique ways of expressing their respect and affection for her. These titles often reflected local history, geography, and spiritual traditions. Some emphasized protection, others emphasized compassion. Still others focused on hope or guidance. Although the names varied, the underlying themes remained familiar. People consistently associated Mary with care, strength, and comfort. As exploration and global travel increased, Mary's image spread even farther. European explorers, missionaries, and settlers carried Marian traditions to the Americas, Asia, and other regions. Local communities often adapted these traditions to their own cultural environments. The result was an even greater diversity of expressions. In Latin America, Marian traditions became deeply connected to cultural identity. In parts of Africa, local artistic styles influenced how Mary was portrayed. Across Asia, communities integrated Marian themes into their own historical and cultural settings. This global expansion transformed Mary into one of the most recognized figures in human history. By the modern era, her image could be found almost everywhere. In grand cathedrals, in village chapels, in museums, in books, in paintings, in music, in public monuments, and eventually, in photographs, films, television programs, and digital media. Technology introduced entirely new ways of sharing Mary's story. Printed books made information more accessible than ever before. Photography allowed people to see religious sites located thousands of miles away. Films brought historical and religious narratives to large audiences. The internet eventually connected people across continents, allowing traditions and ideas to circulate instantly. Despite these changes, certain aspects of Mary's image remained remarkably consistent. Across centuries and cultures, she continued to symbolize compassion. She continued to represent maternal care. She continued to embody resilience in the face of suffering. These qualities helped explain why her influence endured long after the world in which she lived had disappeared. Another remarkable feature of Mary's legacy is how it transcended social divisions. People from different economic backgrounds, educational levels, and cultural traditions often found meaning in her story. Scholars studied her through historical analysis. Artists found inspiration in her image. Religious believers looked to her as a model of faith. Ordinary families connected with her experiences as a mother and caregiver. Few historical figures possess such broad appeal. The 20th and 21st centuries brought new interpretations as well. Modern historians examine the historical context of Mary's life. Archaeologists explored the world in which she lived. Writers and filmmakers reimagined her story for contemporary audiences. Theologians continued discussing her significance. Meanwhile, countless individuals continued finding personal meaning in her example. Today, more than 2,000 years after her lifetime, Mary's story remains alive. New books are written about her every year. New artworks are created. New musical compositions emerge. Academic conferences explore historical questions connected to her life. Pilgrims continue visiting sites associated with her memory. Families continue sharing stories about her with future generations. This enduring interest reveals something important. Mary's influence cannot be explained solely by history, religion, or culture alone. Instead, it reflects the power of a story that touches universal human experiences: love, family, hope, sacrifice, loss, perseverance. These experiences belong to every generation. Because Mary's story is connected to them, it continues speaking to people across time. The young woman from Nazareth never sought fame. She never pursued political power. She never built an empire. Yet through the centuries, her memory became larger than kingdoms, stronger than borders, and more enduring than many rulers whose names have been forgotten. Her story traveled farther than she ever traveled. Her influence lasted longer than she could have imagined. And as history continued moving forward, Mary became not only a figure of the past but also a lasting symbol within humanity's shared cultural memory. The woman whose life began in relative obscurity had become a global icon, and her journey through history was far from over. More than 2,000 years have passed since Mary lived in the small towns and villages of the ancient Middle East. The Roman Empire that governed her world no longer exists. The roads she traveled have changed. The cities she knew have been transformed by centuries of history. Entire civilizations have risen and fallen since her lifetime. Yet remarkably, Mary's story remains alive. Across the world, billions of people recognize her name. Her image appears in churches, museums, books, artworks, films, and educational materials. Scholars continue studying her historical context. Artists continue finding inspiration in her life. Religious communities continue reflecting on her example. Few individuals from the ancient world remain as widely known today as Mary. What explains this extraordinary endurance? Part of the answer lies in the humanity of her story. Although history remembers Mary because of her connection to events that shaped world religion, her life was also deeply human. She experienced uncertainty. She faced difficult decisions. She endured hardship. She cared for family members. She worried about the future. She experienced profound grief. These experiences are not limited to one culture, one religion, or one historical period. They belong to humanity itself. Because of this, people living in the modern world can still find points of connection with Mary's story. Parents understand her devotion to her child. Families understand the importance she placed on relationships. Those who have endured loss understand the depth of her sorrow. Individuals facing uncertainty understand the courage required to move forward when the future isn't clear. In this way, Mary's story continues speaking across centuries. The modern world differs dramatically from the world Mary knew. Technology has transformed communication, transportation, medicine, and education. Information travels instantly across the globe. People can communicate with others thousands of miles away in real time. Scientific discoveries have reshaped humanity's understanding of the universe. Yet despite these changes, many of the fundamental human experiences reflected in Mary's life remain the same. People still seek meaning. People still care for families. People still experience joy and sorrow. People still struggle with uncertainty. People still hope for a better future. Because these realities remain unchanged, Mary's story retains its relevance. Modern historians approach Mary from a variety of perspectives. Some focus on the historical environment in which she lived. Others examine how traditions about her developed over time. Archaeologists study the world of first-century Judea and Galilee to better understand daily life during her lifetime. Scholars analyze ancient texts and compare different sources. These efforts continue expanding humanity's understanding of Mary and the society in which she lived. At the same time, religious communities continue viewing her as an important spiritual figure. Different Christian traditions understand Mary's role in different ways, yet nearly all recognize her significance within the story of Christianity. Beyond Christianity, Mary's respected position within Islam creates a unique bridge between faith communities. In a world often divided by misunderstanding and conflict, this shared respect remains noteworthy. It demonstrates that certain historical figures can transcend boundaries and foster mutual appreciation. Mary's influence also remains visible in art and culture. Museums across the world contain masterpieces inspired by her story. Some of history's greatest painters devoted their talents to portraying her. Architects designed magnificent structures in her honor. Composers created enduring musical works inspired by her life. These cultural contributions continue enriching humanity's artistic heritage. Even people who are not religious often encounter Mary's influence through literature, music, architecture, and visual art. Her story has become part of global culture. Another reason Mary's legacy endures is her association with qualities that people continue to value. Compassion remains important. Kindness remains important. Perseverance remains important. Strength in difficult circumstances remains important. These qualities are admired across cultures and generations. When people reflect upon Mary, they often see these characteristics represented in her life. The modern world faces challenges very different from those of the first century. Global conflicts, economic uncertainty, environmental concerns, technological change, and social transformation affect millions of lives. Yet amid these complexities, stories that emphasize resilience and hope continue to matter. Mary's story offers one such example. It is not a story of military conquest. It is not a story of political dominance. It is not a story of wealth or power. Instead, it is a story centered on endurance, care, and faithfulness through changing circumstances. That message remains meaningful in any era. Mary's legacy also highlights an important truth about history itself. The individuals who shape history are not always rulers, generals, or political leaders. Sometimes influence emerges through character rather than authority. Sometimes the most enduring legacies belong to people whose lives were rooted in family, community, and personal relationships. Mary represents this reality. She began life as an ordinary young woman in an ordinary village, yet her influence eventually reached across continents and centuries. Her story reminds us that history is shaped not only by institutions and governments but also by individual lives. Today, people encounter Mary in many different ways. Some study her through academic research. Some encounter her through religious traditions. Some learn about her through art, literature, or music. Others simply recognize her as one of the most important women in world history. These diverse approaches reflect the breadth of her influence. No single perspective can fully capture everything Mary has come to represent. For some, she is primarily a historical figure. For others, she is a spiritual example. For others still, she is a cultural symbol whose impact extends far beyond religious boundaries. Together, these perspectives help explain why interest in Mary continues after more than 2 millennia. The world has changed dramatically since her lifetime. Empires have disappeared. Languages have evolved. Technologies have transformed civilization. Yet Mary's story remains part of humanity's shared memory. That continuity is remarkable. Few figures from antiquity have maintained such enduring relevance. As new generations emerge, they continue discovering her story for the first time. Students learn about her in history and religion courses. Readers encounter her through books and articles. Travelers visit places associated with her life and legacy. Artists continue drawing inspiration from her example. The story continues. And perhaps that is one of the most important aspects of Mary's legacy. It is not confined to the past. It remains active in the present. People continue discussing, studying, interpreting, and reflecting upon her life. Her story remains part of ongoing conversations about history, faith, culture, family, and human experience. In this sense, Mary belongs not only to ancient history, but also to the modern world. Her life began in a small corner of the Roman Empire. Her influence spread across civilizations. Her memory endured through centuries of change. And today, more than 2,000 years later, her story continues to inspire curiosity, reflection, and admiration. That is why Mary remains one of the most remarkable figures in human history. Not because she ruled nations, not because she commanded armies, not because she sought fame, but because her life touched themes that never grow old: love, family, courage, sacrifice, compassion, hope. These are the qualities that connect generations. These are the qualities that connect cultures. And these are the qualities that have allowed Mary's story to endure through the ages. Conclusion. The story of Mary begins in a humble setting and unfolds across one of the most extraordinary journeys in human memory. From her birth in the ancient world to her lasting influence on billions of people, her life became part of a story far larger than herself. She experienced the ordinary realities of human existence while becoming connected to events that changed history. She knew joy and sorrow, certainty and uncertainty, quiet years and moments of great significance. After her death, her legacy continued growing through the efforts of those who remembered her, wrote about her, painted her image, composed music in her honor, and shared her story with future generations. Today, Mary remains one of the most recognized and influential women who have ever lived. Her story has crossed centuries, cultures, languages, and continents. And as long as people continue valuing compassion, resilience, courage, and hope, the story of Mary will continue to be told.